This is a continuation of verse by verse through Romans chapter 11, where Paul picked up the subject about Israel, chapters 9, 10, and 11. And in this section from 11 to 24, I'm going to call it the humble considers the fall of the proud. Because in verse 11 of chapter 11, a question is asked, and it says, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? And the answer is, God forbid. Now, that fall there is that a permanent or temporary fall? Well, it's obviously a temporary fall, but the British Israelites or the replacement folks want to make it a permanent fall. But this is only a temporary fall, and it's not dealing with all of Israel, because he has already mentioned that there is a Jewish remnant. In Proverbs 16, verse 18, he tells why they fell. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Now, Simeon revealed that there is a fall and rising, so it is not a permanent fall. In Luke 2:34, it says, Simeon blessed them and said unto Mary his mother, Behold, this child is set for the fall and rising again of many in Israel, and for a sign which shall be spoken against, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. Okay, so this passage, this section, is offering hope to the humble believer, and it's offering severity to the proud unbeliever. Now, when I'm using the word believer and unbeliever, I'm not dealing with salvation per se. I'm dealing with believing or unbelieving the promises of God that were directed to Israel. In Matthew 21, verse 42, Jesus saith unto them, Did ye never read in the Scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, the same is become the head of the corner? This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say unto you, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you and given to a nation, bringing forth the fruits thereof. And whosoever shall fall on this stone shall be broken. But on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. So the passage is offering hope to the humble believer, and it's revealing severity to the unbeliever, dealing with the words of God themselves. Paul is warning proud Israel and proud Gentiles of being cut off. Not dealing with salvation. He's dealing with them being cut off. So 11, verse 11, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Answer, God forbid. But rather through their fall, salvation has come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? So God is using the Gentiles to taunt Israel to come back to him, just as God used Job to taunt Satan in that storyline. In verse 13, Paul says, For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. So Paul is warning the Gentiles, using the fall of Israel, the temporary fall of Israel, the blindness of Israel, the hardening of Israel, and telling the Gentiles, if you do the same thing, then you're going to be blinded and hardened also. Not dealing with salvation. Paul here is the apostle to the Gentiles. He is the chosen apostle by God for the Gentiles. As God chose Moses to lead the children of Israel, and he revealed to Moses the doctrines for Judaism on Mount Sinai, so God also chose Paul to be the standard for doctrine for the church time period, and he revealed these doctrines to Paul on Mount Sinai. Paul's burden was the Jew first and the Gentiles second, but his calling was the Gentiles first and the Jews second. Peter, James, and John are specific apostles to the circumcision. So in their writings, you're going to see that they go Jew first and Gentiles second. Now, Peter did advise the Jewish people to read Paul's writings in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 and 16. So Paul is the standard. His letters are the standard for New Testament doctrine for born-again believers. In verse 14, he says, if by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. So he's telling us Gentiles, he's using us to provoke the Jews that might save some of them. And that will be the humble believer, where they will recognize this. In verse 15 he says, for if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? So Israel will be restored, but it will simply be given to the Jewish remnant, the humble Israel, that will be the ones that will be the recipients of the inheritance. In verse 16, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root be holy, and so are the branches. Okay, the first fruit that he mentions here. Okay, first fruits appears to be in Exodus 4, verse 22 and 23, where they're the firstborn son of God. Peter calls them the chosen nation, a holy nation, 1 Peter 2, verse 9. John reveals them to be the first fruits in Revelation chapter 14, the 144,000 the Jewish virgins in Revelation chapter 14, verse 4, he says this, these are they which are not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb, whithersoever he goeth. These are the redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto God and unto the Lamb. Now, James brings this idea up also in James 1:18, where he says, of his own will begat he us. Us in that context is the 12 tribes mentioned in 1 verse 1, with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Okay, so this is the Jewish remnant of the 144,000 will be considered equal to the first fruits of Israel back in Exodus 4. It's very similar in our country where we had the original 13 colonies. When the 13 colonies became 13 individual states, and then a 14th and a 15th and a 16th and a 7th and so forth, so on, the new state that entered into this union of states came in with the same equal status of the original 13. So these Jews of the tribulation time period will come into the equal status of the first fruits of God of Israel, where God said they were holy. As he told Moses, he was standing on holy ground. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, he says this, for thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself above all people that are upon the face of all the earth. Then you bring this into Daniel 9, into Daniel's 70 weeks, and he'll say something like this again. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, and then so forth down on that passage. In Daniel 12, verse 7, he says here, I heard a man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto the heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, that it shall be a time, times, and half a time, when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people. All these things shall be finished. And then I want to read 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter brings in that idea again, giving us knowledge that Peter is an apostle to the circumcision. 1 Peter 2:9, for ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people. Who is that? Well, it's Israel. It's Israel. It's not counterfeit Israel. It's not fake Israel. It's a Jewish remnant called the first fruits. Okay, and then in Romans 11:17, and if some of the branches be broken off, and thou being a wild olive tree wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. So the Lord, throughout the Bible, you'll have back in the Garden of Eden, there appears to be three unique trees: a vine tree, a fig tree, and an olive tree. The vine tree appears to have been the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The olive tree appears to have been the tree of life. And the fig tree was there because that's what Adam and Eve took the leaves of to portray self-righteousness. In Isaiah 5, Isaiah uses the vine tree to portray true Israel. Isaiah 5, the first 7 verses. In Matthew 24, a fig tree appears to be used for Israel, but that may be counterfeit Israel. Matthew 24, verse 32, now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. And then Jeremiah, he portrays Israel to be an olive tree in Jeremiah 11:16, where it reads, the Lord called thy name a green olive tree, fair and of goodly fruit, with the noise of a great tumult. He hath kindled fire upon it, and the branches of it are broken. Okay, as mentioned in Romans chapter 11. I suppose a person could take some time and try to figure those things out, and I'm not going to be definitive on it or dogmatic on it, but the vine tree seems to be Israel in the Old Testament. The fig tree appears to be possibly a counterfeit or a fake Israel, and then the olive tree may be Israel inheriting the millennial promises of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So as Paul is speaking to the Gentiles about Israel during the church time period, in verse 18 he says, boast not against the branches. So that is fair warning to Gentiles that if you're going to get a big head, because God has blinded Israel in part, and you know a little more Bible, a lot more Bible than Israel does, you best not get a big head, boast not against the branches, because it just might come back on you also. So it says, boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also not spare thee. So that's a good, fair warning. And he says, behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God, on whom which fell severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. Okay, this is not dealing with salvation. It's dealing with the promises of God to Israel. Now, all replacement theology proponents must change words of the Bible to justify their unbelief. Paul is not claiming here the cutting off of one losing salvation. The cutting off it will be the belief in God, the belief in the promises of God toward Israel, and it will, end result, will be a blindness, or worse off, a hard-heartedness. If you look up the words cut off, they're found 194 times in the Bible. The first occurrence will be in Genesis 9:11. I don't know if that number kind of rings a bell, 9:11. And that's the cutting off by judgment and death. In Lamentations chapter 2, when Judah was cut off or destroyed by Babylon, it reads in verse 3, "He hath cut off in his fierce anger all the horn of Israel. He hath drawn back his right hand from before the enemy, and burned against Jacob like a flaming fire, which devoureth round about." And then in Daniel 9, in the great 70-year prophecy, he mentions in verse 26, "And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off." So this cutting off, according to the Arminians, is one losing salvation, and that's not what it's saying. The natural branches in this context will be Israel, and the Gentiles will be the wild olive branches. You see, God is not a deist. But God does not intervene in every situation either. If the issue is flexible, God can be moved to action through prayer. Okay, Moses demonstrated that in Exodus 32. But if the issue is etched in stone, sworn to truth, God took an oath to himself, God will not repent. Balaam said that when Balaam was desiring to curse Israel, and God wouldn't let him do it. And so the British Israelites, or the replacement theologians who are cursing Israel, okay, God is going to bless Israel, the Jewish remnant. But God will allow nature take its course when man exercises his free will against the will of God. You see, in some events, God is in absolute control, but in many events, God allows man to decide it and reap the natural consequences. Okay, the transgender movement parallels the replacement theology movement in that they're going to use their free will and go against the promises of God. They're going to change some things. So the transgender movement is going to try to change their gender. And they're going to take all these hormone shots and all this stuff. And when nature takes its course, the older this person gets, the more their body is going to break down because they are messing with the DNA that God has created. And they're going to suffer the consequences. And the same holds true to prideful Gentiles who fail to believe the promises of God to Israel. He says in verse 24, "And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree?" Yes, and that will happen during the millennial time period. You see, as Paul said back in 9 verse 6, not all Israel's Israel. And then he also said there is a Jewish remnant. So Paul is warning here in Romans 11, in this section, he is warning unbelieving Israel will remain blinded, hardened, and cut off. Humble Israelites who humble themselves and turn toward God and believe will be restored to their kingdom. James 4:10, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift thee up. The other warning is to Gentiles, born-again believers in Jesus Christ who try to replace these promises or transfer them or transgender them to the church will suffer loss and be blinded and possibly even hardened. They started a process. God will complete the process. But true, sincere, honest, humble believers in the promises of God will be awarded more light. So Paul has given us, to the humble, he's telling the humble, consider the fall of the proud. Don't end up like them. Believe God. Like Paul said in Acts 27:25, I believe God even as it was told me.